He gave his last sandwich to a starving stray dog and got fired for it. But what happened minutes later will leave you speechless. Sometimes, doing the right thing can cost you everything. At least, that's what it felt like for James, a regular delivery guy just trying to get through his shift. But one small act of kindness, feeding a hungry dog, set off a chain of events he never expected. This story isn't just about a man and a dog. It's about how karma watches everything, and when the time is right, it strikes. James had always been the kind of guy who kept his head down. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He just worked. Every day, 6 days a week. He drove an old delivery van through the city, dropping off packages, grabbing quick lunches, and dealing with grumpy customers and tight deadlines. But that morning was different. The sky was gray, and the city felt colder than usual. Not just because of the weather, but because of what he saw on his route. A little dog, matted fur, skin showing, ribs poking out like jagged bones under his dull brown coat. It wasn't even barking or whining. It was just sitting, waiting. James slowed down. His route was already packed, and he had 10 more stops to make before lunch. But something about that dog, it reminded him of his childhood pup Max, who had passed away during a cold winter, just like this one. He drove past. He tried, but guilt hit like a brick. He pulled into a gas station, grabbed the sandwich from his lunchbox, and circled back. The dog hadn't moved an inch. James knelt down, ripped the sandwich in half, and placed it gently in front of the dog. And for a second, just a second, the world stopped. That dog looked at him like he had just saved its life. It wagged its tail slowly, almost unsure if it was okay to feel hope again. James smiled, and then came the voice, harsh, cold. "James, what the hell are you doing?" His boss. James turned around, startled. Standing behind him was Mr. Thompson, his supervisor, a man known for his strict adherence to schedules and zero tolerance for deviations. "I asked you a question, James." Mr. Thompson's voice was sharp. I was just feeding this stray. It looked hungry," James replied, gesturing toward the dog. Mr. Thompson's eyes narrowed. "You're on company time. This isn't a charity. Get back in the van." James hesitated, looking back at the dog, which was now cautiously nibbling on the sandwich. "I understand, sir, but it just seemed wrong to ignore it," James said softly. Mr. Thompson sighed, pulling out his phone. "This is exactly why we have protocols. You're behind schedule now. I have no choice but to report this." James felt a knot form in his stomach. He knew the company valued efficiency above all else, but he hadn't anticipated such a severe reaction. Back at the depot, James was called into the office. The atmosphere was tense. "James, we've reviewed the incident," Mr. Thompson began. "Your actions today were unprofessional and against company policy. We have to let you go." James sat in silence, the words sinking in. "Fired for feeding a hungry dog." He left the office, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. As he stepped outside, he saw the dog sitting by the van, tail wagging slowly. James approached it, kneeling down. "Looks like we're both out of a job now," he whispered. The dog leaned into him, offering a small lick on his hand. James decided to take the dog home, naming him Buddy. Over the next few days, he searched for new employment, but his mind kept returning to that moment, the simple act of kindness that cost him his job. One morning, while walking Buddy in the park, a woman approached them. "Excuse me," she said. "Is this your dog?" James explained the story, from the encounter to his termination. The woman smiled. "I'm the director of a local animal shelter. We could use someone like you, someone who cares." James's eyes lit up. "Really?" She nodded. "Come by tomorrow. Let's talk." James began working at the shelter, finding fulfillment in helping animals in need. His story spread, inspiring others to act with kindness. He realized that sometimes doing the right thing comes with challenges, but it also opens doors to unexpected opportunities. And as for Buddy, he became the shelter's unofficial mascot, a symbol of hope and the power of compassion. Mr. Collins, he was the kind of man who never blinked first. Sharp suits, sharper tongue, the type of boss who believed that compassion was weakness and kindness was a waste of time. James had worked under him for nearly a decade, yet the man hadn't once remembered his birthday, asked how his weekend was, or even said good morning without a frown. That day, Mr. Collins didn't just frown, he stormed, boots crunching on the gravel, eyes locked like lasers. His coat flared behind him like a cape of disappointment. He slammed the van door shut before James could even get out. "You're behind schedule. Why the hell are you feeding strays?" he barked, his voice echoing in the parking lot like a slap. James stood still. His breath fogged the cold air. He glanced at the little dog, still finishing the last piece of sandwich with such gentleness it hurt to watch. James looked up, his voice low but steady. "Sir." It looked like it hadn't eaten in days. No excuses," Collins snapped. "You're being paid to deliver, not play animal rescue." James took a step back. "It took me 5 minutes. 5 minutes is a missed deadline, a disappointed client, a black mark on our reliability." Collins' voice grew colder. "We aren't running a charity." For a moment, James stayed quiet. Then he did something he never did before. He spoke. "You ever been hungry, sir?" Collins narrowed his eyes. "Excuse me. You ever gone to bed wondering if you'd eat the next day? You ever had to ration instant noodles for 3 days just to get through the week?" Collins didn't respond, just glared. James continued, "Because I have. I know what that dog felt. I couldn't just leave him." There was a pause, a heavy one. Then Collins said 2 words. "You're done." The silence after was louder than any argument James could have made. 10 years. No final warning. No second chances. Just like that, James was fired. The van was taken. His ID badge was stripped. By lunchtime, he stood on the sidewalk holding a cardboard box filled with loose papers. A mug that said, "World's Okayest Driver," and a pair of gloves his niece had knitted him last Christmas. But he wasn't alone. The little dog had followed him. It padded quietly behind, tail low but wagging with every step. When James finally stopped and sat on the cold curb outside the building, the dog curled beside him like it had always belonged there. James looked down and gave a soft, bitter chuckle. "Well, buddy, guess we're both strays now." Time passed slowly. Each minute dragged like it was stuck in mud. People came and went. Some glanced at him. Others whispered, "That's the guy who got fired over a dog." Someone muttered, "He was always quiet, weird but polite," said another. James didn't look up. He was trying not to cry. He wasn't crying over the job. Not really. It was the way it happened. The coldness, the humiliation, the way Collins made it feel like James' heart, his simple act of kindness, was a problem to be solved, not a value to be honored. His stomach growled. He hadn't eaten anything since breakfast. His sandwich had gone to the dog, and weirdly, he didn't regret it. The dog, James decided to call him Buddy, rested its head on James' shoe and sighed. It was a deep sigh, the kind that said, "I've been through hell too." That's when James realized something else. They weren't just both strays. They were survivors. As the wind picked up and the day grew colder, James pulled off his coat and wrapped it halfway around Buddy. He'd be cold, sure, but not as cold as someone with fur matted from weeks of neglect. A woman in a red coat walked by. She paused. "That your dog?" James shook his head. "Not really. Just a friend." She nodded slowly and kept walking. A minute later, she returned with a steaming paper cup. "Hot cocoa," she said, "for the friend." James smiled. The warmth of the drink wasn't just in the cup. An hour passed. Then another. James' phone buzzed. He checked it. A friend from high school had messaged him. "Dude, you're all over the internet. Check Twitter." James frowned, opened the app, and froze. His face, Buddy's face, side by side in a grainy video clip. The caption, "This man got fired for feeding a starving dog. Let's make sure he never regrets it." The video had nearly 2 million views. His hands trembled as he scrolled. Thousands of comments. "Give this man a medal. Where's his GoFundMe? I want to help." Not all heroes wear capes. Some drive vans and carry sandwiches. Then came the car. Sleek, black, pulled right up to the curb. A woman in her 60s stepped out, dressed in a long wool coat and cashmere scarf. Poised, elegant, a kind face with a strength behind her eyes. "Are you James?" she asked gently. James blinked. "Oh yeah, that's me. I'm Eleanor Grant," she said, extending a hand. "Founder of Haven Hearts Animal Rescue." He shook her hand, stunned silent. She nodded to the man with the camera across the street. "That's my assistant. He filmed what happened. We were in the area scouting a location when we saw you with the dog. We posted it online." James was still catching up. She crouched down and stroked Buddy's ears. "This little guy, he's been missing for 3 weeks. Escaped during a thunderstorm. We'd nearly given up." Buddy whined, tail wagging. His eyes looked up at her with a flicker of recognition. "You saved him," she said. James shook his head. "I just gave him a sandwich. You gave him hope." She stood. "I have an offer." James blinked. "An offer?" Eleanor smiled. "Come with us. We've got a shelter that could use someone like you. Not just someone who works, but someone who cares." James didn't respond immediately. He looked down at Buddy, who was now sitting beside Eleanor, tail thumping against the pavement. He looked at the box in his lap, the one with his ID badge, old coffee mug, and fading gloves. Then he looked up. "I'm in." Eleanor stood back up and looked James straight in the eye. Listen, you lost your job for doing the right thing. That says a lot about your character, and we could use someone like you. For a few seconds, James didn't say a word. His breath clouded in the cold air, mingling with the faint mist that had begun to roll in. Cars moved lazily in the background. Horns honked, distant and indifferent. But in that moment, everything else faded. There was only Eleanor, Buddy, and the ache in James's chest that was slowly transforming into something else. Something warm. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. Eleanor smiled gently. "Dead serious. Come with me. I want to show you something." Buddy gave a tiny bark, as if in agreement, and trotted ahead as Eleanor opened the car door. James hesitated for just a breath. His life had changed so drastically in the last few hours. He wasn't sure if he could trust anything anymore, but he followed, because something about this moment felt different. It felt like the universe was finally nudging him forward instead of shoving him down. The drive wasn't long, maybe 15 minutes out of the city, but with every passing block, the surroundings changed. The cracked sidewalks and rusted buildings gave way to wide streets lined with trees, their branches bare but elegant. Eventually, they pulled into a private driveway that led to a large, renovated barn with a hand-painted sign above the entrance. Haven Paws Sanctuary. James stared out the window, eyes wide. The place was alive. Dozens of volunteers bustled around, feeding animals, repairing kennels, laughing as dogs ran freely in a large, fenced-in yard. Cats sunned themselves on the windowsills. There was no cold here, at least not the emotional kind. "This is where I work," Eleanor said, stepping out of the car. "And if you're ready, this is where your next chapter begins." James stepped out slowly. The crunch of gravel under his boots reminded him he was still standing on Earth, still part of a world that somehow still had room for miracles. Eleanor led him inside. The barn was converted into a 2-story facility, bottom floor for animals, upper for administration. Everything smelled like hay and pine and shampooed fur. Warm lights hung from wooden beams, casting a cozy golden hue. A dog barked in greeting, and a cat stretched on a heater vent, purring lazily. "This place, it's incredible," James murmured. Eleanor nodded. "It started as a garage with 6 crates. Now, it's one of the biggest no-kill sanctuaries in the state. We rehome hundreds of animals a year, and we need drivers, people with heart, people like you." James turned slowly, taking it all in. A golden retriever padded up and nudged his hand. A child and her mom waved from across the yard as they played with a pair of energetic puppies. He looked at Buddy, who was already being smothered in affection by 2 volunteers. "You said you wanted me to help tell rescue stories?" he asked. Eleanor's eyes lit up. "Yes, you've got a storyteller's heart, James, and I've seen the way you connect. We want you on the road, picking up animals from bad situations, delivering them to safety, and sharing their stories. People listen to stories. It's how hearts change." James felt something deep in his chest uncoil, something that had been wound tight for years. A pressure he didn't even know he'd been living with began to fade. He looked out the window. The clouds had started to break. "Just a little. I'm in," he said. Eleanor smiled. "Good. Welcome to Haven Paws." That night, James didn't go home, because for the first time in what felt like years, he didn't want to. He stayed at Haven Paws. The staff set him up in the guest quarters, just a small, cozy room above the barn with a bed, a wooden desk, and a heater that rattled like it had a personality of its own. Buddy curled up right beside him on the floor, though he'd been offered his own heated bed in the hallway. But he wouldn't leave James's side. James lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. The day's events swirled through his head like a whirlwind. Mr. Collins's face, the finality of "you're done," the feel of the sidewalk against his jeans, and then Eleanor, her offer. This place. How could so much change in just one day? But maybe that was the nature of life. Maybe rock bottom wasn't the end, just the point where you finally had to look up. The next morning, James woke up to something unexpected: laughter. Children laughing. He sat up, blinking groggily, and peeked out the window. A small group of kids were visiting the sanctuary as part of a school outreach program. They wore brightly colored coats and clutched little notepads as they listened to a volunteer explain how each animal had come here. Some were rescues from puppy mills, others abandoned on highways. A few had been left tied to fences in the dead of night. And yet here they were, tail wagging, tongue lolling, proof that even after cruelty, joy could bloom. James came downstairs, and a few of the staff greeted him with nods and smiles. No one treated him like the guy who lost his job. Here he was just James. He was given a uniform shirt, forest green with a small embroidered paw print over the chest, and a clipboard with the words Orientation Day written across the top. "Don't worry," the receptionist said, grinning. "We won't throw you to the wolves." Metaphorically speaking, of course. But James didn't need to be eased in. He jumped in head first. He spent the entire day learning routes, protocols, emergency response steps, and even CPR for animals. He helped lift crates, unload food supplies, clean kennels, and document new arrivals. By sundown, he was sore in places he didn't know existed, but he couldn't stop smiling, and Buddy followed him everywhere. The staff started calling them the duo. That night, Eleanor handed James a manila folder. Inside were official documents, contract terms, salary details, and benefits. There was also a small note, written in her tidy handwriting. "You gave kindness without expecting anything. Now the world gives it back." James didn't even try to hide the tears. He let them fall freely. He signed the contract without hesitation. 1 week later, James was given his own van. It wasn't fancy, just a white cargo vehicle with insulated interiors and the Haven Paws logo on both sides. But it was his. It had been retrofitted to transport animals comfortably. Climate-controlled crates, emergency supplies, a first aid kit, and even a camera mounted on the dash for recording stories. But the best part? A padded passenger seat, custom-stitched with a name. Buddy. When James saw it, he laughed out loud. Buddy barked excitedly and jumped right in, tail wagging like a metronome set to joy. Their first assignment came the next morning. A report had come in about 3 dogs abandoned on a rural property 2 hours away. A team had already coordinated with local authorities. All that was needed was someone to go and bring them home. James and Buddy hit the road before dawn. The drive was quiet at first, just soft music on the radio and the rhythmic hum of tires on the road. But as the sun began to rise, spilling gold across the horizon, James felt something inside him rise too. Not hope, purpose. He pulled up to a weathered farmhouse, where a sheriff and a volunteer were waiting beside 3 thin, scared dogs. Their ribs showed. One limped, another flinched when someone raised their hand too fast. James knelt slowly. "It's okay," he whispered, extending his hand. The dogs hesitated. Then one by one, they came forward. They trusted him. And as James gently guided them into the van, he looked over at Buddy, who sat in his seat, calm and steady, like a co-pilot, like a partner, like family. James didn't speak the whole drive back. He didn't need to. Buddy kept glancing at him, tongue out, eyes full of affection. It was silent, but it was sacred. By the end of the second week, James had transported over a dozen animals, each with a different story, each with a different set of scars. But every time, the result was the same. He delivered them from darkness to light. He started recording little clips during pickups, then full videos. He'd narrate the journey in a soft voice, explaining where each dog or cat had come from. He didn't dramatize it. He just told the truth. His videos started going viral. Again, people remembered the man who'd been fired for feeding a stray. Now, he was becoming a symbol of something much bigger, a reminder that compassion should cost you something, but it always gives you more in return. 3 weeks after that first day at Haven Paws, James stood in front of a crowded auditorium at the state's largest animal welfare conference. He wasn't wearing a suit, just his green rescue shirt, jeans, and worn-out boots, still dusted from the morning's kennel walk. But when Eleanor introduced him as the man whose heart changed 1,000 minds, the applause was deafening. James stepped up to the mic, cleared his throat, and glanced down at the first slide of his presentation. A still shot of Buddy licking crumbs from the pavement on that rainy morning. He paused, took a breath, and said quietly, "This is where it all began." The audience leaned in, and James told them everything. Not with drama, not with flair, but with honesty. He spoke about losing his job, about the cold sidewalk, about people looking away like he didn't exist, about how one tiny, hungry dog had reminded him that dignity wasn't about what you earned, it was about what you gave, even when you had nothing. He talked about the first rescue trip, the broken animals, the stories behind their eyes. And he finished with this: "We don't need to be heroes. We just need to notice. Notice the ones in need. Notice the things that hurt, even when they're small. Because the moment we stop noticing, that's when the world gets cold." There was silence, and then another wave of applause, longer, louder, and filled with something deeper than admiration, respect. Later that evening, James walked back to the van with Buddy by his side. The sun was setting, casting orange shadows over the parking lot. He opened the passenger door, and Buddy jumped up into his seat, with the name still stitched in bold white letters. James climbed into the driver's side, and just sat there for a moment, thinking, breathing, smiling. He turned to Buddy and whispered, "We did good, huh?" Buddy barked softly, tail thumping against the seat, like a heartbeat. They drove off slowly, the city fading behind them. Ahead, more towns, more animals, more stories. But before they left the city limits, James took one last detour. He parked a block away from his old delivery company. The warehouse looked the same, gray walls, the same clunky loading doors, trucks lined up like dominoes. Except now, it didn't intimidate him. It didn't define him. It was just a place. He stepped out and stood across the street, watching, and then he saw him, Mr. Collins, still yelling at drivers, still glued to the tracker screen, still walking like the world owed him something. He hadn't changed, but James had. He gave the building one final nod, then walked back to the van. As he climbed in, a teenager who had recognized him from the viral videos ran over and tapped on the window. "Hey, are you the guy who saved that dog?" James looked at Buddy, then back at the kid. "Actually," he said with a grin, "I think he saved me." 6 months later, James's story had become a case study in over 30 schools across the country. He was invited to speak at youth centers, correctional facilities, and even corporate events, talking about ethics, compassion, and how small acts of kindness ripple far beyond what we see. But James never let it get to his head. He still wore the same shirt, still drove the same van, still spent nights scrubbing cages, sitting with scared animals, or holding a dog's paw during its final moments when no one else could. Because for James, this was the life he was meant for. Not fast-paced, not high-paying, but real, raw, honest. One Nowy evening, as they drove back from a winter rescue mission in the mountains, James pulled over to the side of the road. There was no traffic, just silence and snowflakes tumbling from the sky like feathers. He stepped out, leaned against the hood, and watched the clouds move. Buddy came up beside him and sat down, his breath fogging the air. James reached down, scratched behind his ears, and murmured, "You know, if I hadn't stopped for you that day, I wouldn't be here. I'd still be stuck, still miserable." Buddy leaned into him, pressing his head into James's chest. "I didn't save you," James whispered. "You saved me. You reminded me who I was." A long pause, a deep breath. Then, Buddy barked once, sharp and loud, almost like agreement. And in that moment, James realized something. He hadn't just found a job. He hadn't just found a friend. He'd found a mission. From then on, James and Buddy became legends in the rescue world. Not because they did something flashy, but because they showed up every day, rain or shine. Because when the world turns its back on the forgotten, it takes someone to turn around and say, "I see you." And sometimes, all it takes is one man, one dog, and one moment of kindness to change everything. As the days passed and the world around him continued to move at its fast-paced, indifferent rhythm, James started to realize something profound. What he had done that day, that seemingly small act of feeding a hungry stray dog, was no mere coincidence. It wasn't just a random event that had led to his job loss or his eventual acceptance into the world of animal rescue. It was the start of something bigger. In that single moment, where he had stopped and noticed a creature in need, the trajectory of his life had altered. His entire perspective on the world had shifted, like a new lens being placed over his eyes, one that made him see the suffering, the neglected, and the ignored that often went unnoticed by others. He hadn't just saved Buddy, he had saved himself, his heart, his sense of purpose, and his belief that the world could be more than just a place of endless noise and ambition. But that wasn't the only thing he had saved. James knew now that kindness wasn't just something that existed in the grand, dramatic moments. It lived in the quiet, unseen spaces. It wasn't always loud. It didn't always garner praise or admiration. But kindness was a force, a ripple that spread, gently yet unrelenting, across every soul it touched. And sometimes, it didn't even take a large action. Sometimes, it just took being present when someone or something needed it. The feeling of satisfaction that had come from rescuing Buddy, the little dog who had saved him in so many ways, was something James could never have anticipated. It wasn't the applause, the recognition, or the viral videos that mattered to him. It wasn't the social media followers or the new job that had changed his life. It was the quiet moments, the ones that no one else saw, that had begun to shape his understanding of what truly mattered. James wasn't the only one who was transformed by his encounter with Buddy. His story was a quiet whisper, carried across the winds of social media, into the hearts and minds of people all around the world. And soon, people began to act. Some went to their local shelters to adopt a pet. Others volunteered their time to rescue organizations. Some even donated money to causes they had once ignored, while others simply began to take a moment each day to look around them, to notice those who were hurting or in need. All of this had started with one simple act: a man stopping to feed a dog. That small act, performed out of empathy, compassion, and a deep sense of shared humanity, had sparked something in others, a desire to be more than just bystanders in the world. James knew that for some, his story would become a reminder that sometimes it takes so little to change a life. Sometimes it just takes one small decision to make a difference. But that difference, over time, could turn into something monumental. It was like planting a seed of kindness that could grow into something beautiful, something that would sustain and nourish those who came in contact with it. And so, as he traveled from town to town, visiting shelters and speaking at schools, he began to see the ripple effect of his actions. The shelters were busier than ever. More families were adopting pets, and more people were fostering animals in need. Volunteers, once hesitant, now filled the halls of rescue organizations, eager to make a difference. The world wasn't perfect, but it was changing, one small act of kindness at a time. James learned that kindness didn't need to be celebrated. It didn't need to be shouted from the rooftops or recorded for posterity. Kindness could be a quiet, everyday act. It could be the small things, the unspoken gestures of goodwill that, when added up, could create a tidal wave of positive change. The world didn't need more flashy grand gestures. It needed more people who were willing to do the right thing when it mattered, when no one was watching. There were moments, of course, when James would reflect on his journey with a sense of disbelief. How had it all happened so fast? How had a simple, impulsive decision led to such a dramatic change in his life? But then he would remember Buddy's trusting eyes, the way the dog had looked at him that first time, a moment of silent recognition between two souls who had both been lost, both searching for something. When he thought back to his old life, his days of delivering packages, of running errands for a job that had paid the bills but had done nothing for his spirit, he realized how far he had come. His old life had been built on routine, on the mundane, but now his life was built on purpose. He woke up every morning knowing that he was making a difference. He was doing something that mattered, not just for him, but for the animals who needed a voice, for the people who needed to see that kindness was still alive in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. James understood now that kindness wasn't always easy. It wasn't always convenient. Sometimes it cost you something, your time, your energy, your comfort. But in the grand scheme of things, what did that really cost? In the end, what he had gained was far greater. He had gained a sense of belonging, a sense of community, and most importantly, he had gained hope. The people he met on his journey, strangers who became friends, volunteers who became family, had helped him see that the world wasn't just a place of struggle and loss. It was a place of opportunity, an opportunity to make a difference, an opportunity to be the change that was so desperately needed. James's story wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about Buddy. It was about every single person who had ever been down on their luck, who had ever felt alone, who had ever wondered if their small acts of kindness mattered. And in that moment, when he stood in front of a crowd of thousands, sharing his story, he realized something incredibly important. The world didn't just need more acts of kindness. It needed more people willing to perform them, to take the time to look beyond their own lives, beyond their own problems, and to see the world through someone else's eyes. When he looked at the people in the audience, James didn't just see them as listeners. He saw them as fellow warriors, as fellow crusaders in the battle for a better world. And he knew, deep down, that if each of them could carry just a tiny piece of the message that had carried him this far, kindness matters, then maybe, just maybe, the world could be a little less cold, a little more compassionate, a little more forgiving. As the years went by, James continued to speak at events, to travel with Buddy by his side, and to remind people of the simple truth that had saved his life. Sometimes, it's not about changing the world in grand, sweeping gestures. Sometimes, it's about noticing the little things, the things that no one else sees. It's about showing up, being present, and doing what's right, even when it's hard. It's about doing the right thing when no one is watching. And maybe, just maybe, if enough of us do that, the world will change. It might be slow, it might be quiet, but the change will come. So, the next time you see someone struggling, or an animal in need, don't walk away. Even when no one's watching, do the right thing. Because kindness, it always comes back. Sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, but always with purpose. Subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories that celebrate the bond between humans and animals.